Thank you. All of you here know that there is a ever-broadening recognition that climate change poses a severe threat to the U.S. and to the global economies, the societies that we live in. But I spent a lot of my time involved with political activities and a lot of my time in the business world. And at least in my view, I think what there is not is a broadly held sense, an internalized sense of urgency. And for me, that sense of urgency was triggered when I learned that the decay rate, and this is something all of you know, the decay rate of greenhouse gases in the air is over 100 years, well over, it's actually hundreds of years, and that what we do today affects us and will affect us for hundreds of years, so that this set of effects is irreversible and it is cumulative. All of that led me to the view, this was some time ago, this is not something that we can look to the future to deal with, but that we must act, and we must act now. I have a friend who's a very well-known businessman in New York, extremely successful. I mentioned all this to him the other day about climate change, one thing and another. He said to me, yeah, it's important, but we have other more pressing issues, and we can deal with this some decades down the road. My answer to him was, for the reasons I just said to you, that is exactly the opposite of the reality that we face, that the longer we wait, the more it will cost to deal with, and furthermore, that we face not just the baseline severe risks that all of us are familiar with, but the non-linearity that one of our earlier speakers mentioned. And what has most troubled me, and in fact I would say frightened me, is not the severe risks that, as severe as they are, I think we can deal with in one way or another, but rather the very real possibility that we'll have tail risks, and not tail risks with small probabilities, but tail risks with relatively high probabilities that will result in catastrophic effects. These are risks that we cannot take, and that is why, in my judgment, we absolutely must act now. The unfortunate thing, however, is that, at least as I see the world, there is not, as I said a moment ago, that sense of urgency, either in our business world, but even more importantly in our political world, because ultimately with all of the importance of private sector activity, the magnitude of this problem is going to require effective governance, and I don't see any evidence that that effectiveness and will exists. Broadly speaking, I think our president has acted actually heroically, but beyond that, we need to have a broad political consensus, and then ultimately, not ultimately, and then action in both branches, as Senator Kerry mentioned, or Secretary Kerry mentioned. Let me suggest one set of actions we could take that might actually help a little bit with respect to the sense of urgency I just mentioned, and that is this. Bad data leads to bad policy. I recently had the opportunity to participate in something called the Risky Business Project, and what that was a rigorous academic effort to determine what the costs might be of climate change. And out of that came the view that the data as we now measure activity is not providing the kind of guidance that you need, or that we need, both in business and in the political world, for making sound decisions, but rather the contrary, that there's far too little recognition of climate change effects and therefore badly misguided decisions. So I would make three specific suggestions. First, future government spending is going to have to be massively increased to deal with the effects of climate change as emergencies climate change related develop. And I believe that fiscal projections should include projected climate change effects, and you could do that through some kind of standard alternative forecast, much as the CBO now does, Congressional Budget Office now does for other purposes. Secondly, I believe that investors, by the way, I might say, if we had those kinds of projections, I think that might cause politicians and political figures to focus more on and be willing to act with respect to the effects of climate change. Second, investors should demand that companies disclose the risks that climate change create for their businesses. And that goes into three buckets. Number one, the possibility that companies will eventually be held accountable for and have to be responsive to their climate change emissions. Secondly, stranded assets because of climate change. And thirdly, the effects that climate change itself will have on their businesses. Those kinds of disclosures could affect investor behavior, and investor behavior can affect corporate behavior. And thirdly, I believe that our gross domestic product, GDP, as currently constituted, is a misleading measure of economic activity. And one of the principal defects it has is that it fails to account for what we've now all discussed, are the enormous and potentially even catastrophic potential effects of climate change. If we had a parallel GDP that incorporated the climate change effects, then I believe that would have at least some possibility of having impact on policy decisions, so that instead of using the data we have today, which, as I said a moment ago, leads to misguided decisions, we'd have data that reflects the true risks that we face and therefore hopefully led to better outcomes in our decision making. I believe more broadly that if we had better data, both in the business world and in the political world, our elected representatives and our businesses would recognize that we do not face a choice, the choice that's so often posed, between protecting our environment or protecting our economy. I believe, and believe strongly, that we face a choice between protecting our economy by protecting our environment or allowing environmental havoc to create economic havoc and to severely impacting life on Earth as we know it today. Thank you very much.